Okay, so you know how sometimes you're scrolling through the news and you see like a really dramatic headline about some big political shakeup,
Yeah.
and it's easy to kind of jump to conclusions based on just that headline, right?
Right.
But like always, it seems like there's always more to the story.
Yeah, definitely.
So today we are diving deep into Zelensky's recent cabinet shuffle in Ukraine,
Hmm.
trying to figure out why it's making waves and what it might tell us about the bigger picture over there.
Well, I think the timing of it is really interesting because
Okay.
it's been over a year into the war, right?
Right.
And then all of a sudden, Zelensky decides to replace 9 key figures in his cabinet,
Yeah.
including the ministers of foreign affairs and strategic industries.
All right.
That's not just like rearranging some papers on your desk.
Right.
That's a major signal.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should say this is September 2023 when this is happening.
Right.
So a critical juncture in the conflict.
Absolutely.
If you were just like a casual observer just checking the headlines, you might think, "Oh wow, is Ukraine's government like falling apart?"
Yeah, you could see that.
But hold on, because we're going to try to break down all the reasons why that's probably not the case.
Yeah. And I think the way that these dismissals were handled is really telling.
Okay.
This wasn't Zelensky, like, making a rash decision or trying to cover up some sort of scandal.
Mm-hmm.
He made quick appointments to replace the people who were leaving,
Right?
and the people that he replaced them with seemed to be pretty capable.
Okay.
And importantly, the folks who left weren't publicly disgraced or anything.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Before we get into like the why, let's talk about the who.
Yeah, who are these people?
There are some pretty interesting figures at the heart of this.
For sure.
First up, Dmytro Kuleba, the former foreign minister.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about him?
So Kuleba was a really big deal on the world stage.
Okay.
He was the guy meeting with Biden, meeting with Blinken, and he really developed strong relationships with those guys.
Right.
Which, of course, was really important to help Ukraine secure international aid.
Yeah.
So he was really the face of Ukrainian diplomacy throughout this entire thing.
Right. The guy you saw in the news all the time in the war rooms making the case for Ukraine on the world stage.
Exactly.
And then there's Oleksandr Kamyshin, who was the Minister of Strategic Industries. And this is a guy who almost sounds like he came straight out of a movie,
I know.
like a wartime thriller or something.
It's a great story.
Yeah. What's his deal?
So Kamyshin is really interesting because a lot of Ukrainians see him as a hero.
Okay.
And that's because, remember, at the very beginning of the invasion,
Mm-hmm.
the railway system in Ukraine miraculously kept running.
Yeah.
And is evacuating civilians. It was making sure that vital supplies could get to the front lines.
Wow.
And that was all Kamyshin.
Really?
He's the guy who kept the trains running,
Yeah.
even when they were under attack.
Wow. Talk about performing under pressure.
Right.
But on top of that, he's also the guy who's credited with overseeing this massive increase in domestic arms production for Ukraine,
Exactly.
which is not an easy thing to do in the middle of a war.
Right. Like, how do you ramp up weapons manufacturing when you're actively being invaded?
It's unbelievable.
It's amazing. And I think that's why when we see these dismissals, and particularly Kamyshin's dismissal,
Yeah.
it's perplexing.
Yeah.
These weren't ministers who were failing and who were shown the door.
Right. It's not like Zelensky's like cleaning house and these guys were at the bottom of the list.
Right.
These are people who, by all accounts, were like star players.
Exactly.
So I think we have to address the big question.
Yeah.
Is Zelensky losing control here?
Right.
Are these forced resignations?
Is there something happening behind the scenes that we don't know about?
Is there a scandal?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Probably not.
Really?
It seems like the way that these dismissals were handled, the quick replacements, the public perception of those who left, all of it seems to suggest that there's something else going on here.
Okay, so if it's not like a total meltdown in Kyiv,
Right.
then what is the real story?
Yeah, what's the deal?
Buckle up, listeners, because we're going to get into some fascinating theories here.
This is where it gets good.
All right, so let's get into these theories. And I
Yeah.
think the big one that everyone's talking about is the 2024 U.S. election.
Right.
Is it possible that Zelensky is kind of playing 4D chess here?
Yeah?
Making moves now to shore up support for Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
no matter who wins the White House next year?
Well, yeah, it's really hard to ignore the timing of all this.
Right.
Because the U.S. election obviously have huge implications for what happens in Ukraine.
For sure.
And Zelensky knows that keeping that Western support going, especially support from the U.S., is absolutely essential.
Right. It's not a guarantee.
No.
Especially if there's a change in who's in charge over there.
Exactly.
And I think we all know that there's been some speculation about whether a Republican president
Yeah,
would be as supportive of Ukraine as the Biden administration has been.
for sure.
So is that what Zelensky's trying to kind of get ahead of here?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister,
Yeah.
he had a lot of strengths, right?
Yeah, right.
He was good at his job,
Yeah.
but he was also seen as being very close to the Biden administration.
Right. He had those relationships.
So now let's imagine,
Okay.
just for a second,
Yeah.
that Trump wins in 2024
Okay.
and Kuleba is still the guy representing Ukraine.
Okay.
Would that be the best look for Zelensky if he's trying to start fresh with a new administration?
Yeah, like maybe not the best time to have your guy who's like best buds with the previous president.
Right,
To
exactly.
be the one doing the negotiating.
Exactly.
So by replacing him with someone who's maybe a little less partisan,
Right.
someone without all that baggage,
Yeah.
it allows Zelensky to sort of hit the reset button.
Yeah, like a clean slate.
Yeah, diplomatically speaking.
It's about keeping those channels open no matter who's in the Oval Office a year from now.
Right. It's all about making sure that support keeps flowing.
Exactly. And don't forget that Zelensky himself actually said
That's that.
that working with a potential second Trump presidency would be very difficult.
Oh, wow.
So this reshuffle could be his way of putting that idea into action, trying to deal with that challenge before it even really becomes a problem.
Smart. Like some real proactive diplomacy there.
Exactly.
Okay, so theory number 2.
Yeah.
This one takes us from Washington, D.C. to Moscow.
Okay.
Because some people are saying that this cabinet shuffle might actually have less to do with the U.S. election and more to do with Russia's reaction to Ukraine's incursion into Kursk.
Right. The Kursk gambit, as some people are calling it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Because one of the things the sources pointed out
Yeah.
is that Russia's response to this incursion
Right.
has been surprisingly,
muted.
yeah.
Definitely more muted than I think a lot of people expected.
Right.
Like they've moved some troops around and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not like they've completely freaked out.
Right. It doesn't seem like they've like pulled out all the stops to like throw everything they have at repelling this incursion.
Exactly.
It seems like their main focus is still very much on the Donbas region.
Which tells us a couple of things, right?
Yeah, like what?
It could be that Russia is just being very strategic in their response.
Okay.
Or it could be that they're a lot more stretched thin than they want to let on.
Interesting. So what does that mean for Zelensky?
Well, it gives him some options, right?
Yeah.
This cabinet shuffle.
Yeah.
It could be his way of taking advantage of the fact that Russia's distracted right now.
Okay.
It's a way to show the West that he's being adaptable, that he's reassessing the situation,
Okay.
and that he's ready to switch gears if he needs to.
So it's less about like panicking and more about saying like, hey, everyone, we're paying attention. We see what's happening. We're adjusting our game plan here,
Right.
but we still need you to have our backs because this isn't over yet.
Right. And you can't forget about the domestic situation in Ukraine either.
Oh, right. Yeah.
What's going on there?
Zelensky's approval ratings have actually taken a bit of a hit recently,
Really?
which, I mean, is completely understandable
Yeah.
given everything that's going on.
Right.
But this reshuffles, this shakeup
Yeah.
by bringing in some new faces, some new energy.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a way to win back some of that public support.
To kind of reassure people that things are still moving in the right direction.
Right, exactly.
That's interesting.
Because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
even if you're fighting a war,
You can't ignore what's happening back home.
for sure,
You have to make sure that your own people still believe in you.
it's a balancing act for sure.
For sure.
But there is one move in particular that I think is still really throwing people for a loop.
Oh, yeah.
And that's Commission.
Right.
This is the guy
Yeah.
who kept the trains running.
The hero of the railway.
Yeah. The guy who somehow managed to like supercharge Ukrainian arms production in the middle of a war.
Right.
What's the deal with that?
Yeah. It's a head scratcher.
Why would you get rid of your star player like that?
Yeah. It really is like the $1,000,000 question here.
Yeah.
On the surface, it just seems so counterintuitive.
Right.
Like you're in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
And you've got this guy who's basically like single-handedly keeping your war machine running.
Right. And you decide now is the time to like move him to the sidelines.
Right. And that's where I think we need to kind of like take a step back
Okay.
and think about this a little differently.
Yeah.
Because what if moving Commission wasn't actually about demoting him?
Okay.
What if it was about giving him more influence?
All right. I'm listening. Tell me more.
Okay, so as Minister of Strategic Industries,
Mhm.
he obviously had a ton of responsibility.
Right, overseeing a whole ministry.
Right. But it was still just one ministry.
That's true.
Now, though,
Yeah.
he's a direct advisor to Zelensky.
Right.
Which means he has the president's ear on, like, everything.
Oh, wow.
So instead of just focusing on arms production,
Right.
he can now weigh in on all kinds of different stuff.
Like what?
Like diplomacy,
Okay.
military strategy, domestic politics.
Wow.
I mean, you name it.
So you're saying he went from like having a really important but narrow focus to basically being involved in every big picture decision.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's gone from being like a really important player on the field to being like a top strategist in the war room.
Interesting.
And don't forget,
yeah,
this is Commission we're talking about.
Right. The guy who gets things done.
Exactly.
The guy who like makes the impossible happen.
So putting him in a position where he can use those skills across the board could be a really, really smart move for Zelensky.
It's starting to make a lot more sense now.
Right.
It's still risky.
Oh, absolutely.
But I can see how it could potentially pay off big time.
Right. And I think ultimately it all goes back to this idea that Zelensky is constantly adapting.
Right. It's not just about reacting to what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine.
Exactly.
He's also thinking about the global picture.
Right.
About how this war is playing out on the world stage.
Absolutely.
And he's not afraid to make bold moves to try and stay one step ahead.
Right. And whether or not you agree with all of his decisions, you have to admit that this cabinet shuffle, as weird as it seemed at first, really shows how adaptable Zelensky is.
Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder to all of us that when it comes to these really complex situations, it's important to remember that things aren't always what they seem on the surface.
Right, you can't just read a headline and think you know everything that's going on.
You got to be willing to dig a little deeper.
For sure.
To ask the tough questions.
Yeah.
And to never, ever stop being curious.
Well said.
And on that note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive into Zelensky's cabinet shuffle.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Thanks for coming on the show. As always, it's great to have you.
Always a pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, be sure to check back in with us soon for another deep dive into the biggest stories of the day.